The classroom was alive with noise. Pens tapping, chairs scraping, voices colliding in a restless tide. But for the boy sitting at the very back, the sound might as well have belonged to another world. His eyes locked on the teacher's lips, straining to catch meaning from the shapes. One blink, one slip, and the entire sentence vanished. He felt the vibration of footsteps under his shoes, the faint hum of chatter brushing against him like wind. But none of it reached his ears. Silence was his constant companion, and in that silence, cruelty thrived. Two classmates whispered, then laughed. He did not hear the words, but he saw the smirk, the sideways glance. He bent lower over his notebook, pressing his pencil hard into the page as though neat lines could protect him from their disdain. The teacher never slowed down. Lessons were for those who could hear. And so, day after day, he scrambled to hold on to fragments, to salvage knowledge from a storm that never paused. At home, the silence followed him. His father, weary and resigned, muttered over dinner, "What future can he have?" His mother smiled gently, offering food, but her eyes carried the same unspoken question. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The world was silent. But inside him, there was a restless fire. If no one gave him a voice, he would find another way. One afternoon, wandering through the school library, he discovered it. A thin book tucked into a forgotten shelf. Its pages were worn, filled with illustrations of hands shaping letters, numbers, emotions. A guide to sign language. He traced the drawings with trembling fingers, then imitated the gestures clumsily. At first, he felt foolish, waving his hands in the empty air. But then, something clicked. The movements felt natural, as if they had been waiting for him all along. In secret, he practiced each night. His hands ached, his fingers stiffened, but he persisted. Slowly, awkward gestures became fluid. For the first time, silence was no longer a prison. It was a language, hidden but powerful. He began to write more furiously in class. Not just notes, but translations into signs. His classmates still mocked him, still dismissed him, but he held a secret they did not understand. His silence had become alive with words. And in the darkest hours, when doubt crept in, he returned to that vow he scribbled in his notebook. One day, they will listen. History remembers the voices that shouted loudest. But sometimes, it begins with a child in the back of a classroom, whose silence carries more weight than sound. Adolescence offered no refuge. If childhood had been cruel, the teenage years were merciless. Hallways echoed with voices he could not catch, jokes he could not share, secrets he was never invited into. Every lunch break felt like a performance of exclusion, groups laughing in circles, and him alone at the edge, the silence around him thicker than walls. Teachers, though not deliberately harsh, carried impatience like an invisible weapon. They mistook his hesitation for slowness, his silence for ignorance. One suggested to his parents that perhaps he should attend a special school, though none existed nearby. Another shrugged and moved on when he could not answer quickly enough. In a world designed for ears, his eyes could only do so much. At home, the tension grew. His father, proud and pragmatic, wrestled with disappointment he tried to hide. "How will he ever survive?" he muttered when he thought the boy wasn't looking. His mother hovered protectively, smoothing his hair, cooking his favorite meals, as if tenderness could shield him from reality. He needed neither doubt nor pity. What he needed was recognition. He found it in unexpected places. When a classmate stumbled over a math problem, he scribbled the solution neatly on a scrap of paper and slid it across. The boy's eyes lit up, then his hand shot into the air with the correct answer. Small exchanges like this became routine. A quick note, a quiet assist. For the first time, some classmates looked at him not as a burden, but as someone sharp, reliable. Respect flickered briefly, fragile but real. Yet cruelty never vanished. On the playground, a ball struck his shoulder too hard, thrown with deliberate aim. He bent to retrieve it, only to be mocked with exaggerated, twisted hand movements, a parody of the signs he practiced in secret. Laughter erupted. His face burned hot, but he walked away, clutching the ball, his silence harder than steel. That night, his journal became his confession. He scrawled across the page, "One day, this silence will matter. One day, it will not be weakness, but strength." The words steadied him. He practiced signs until his fingers cramped, until exhaustion dulled the sting of humiliation. The breakthrough came when he learned he was not alone. In a small community hall across town, he discovered gatherings of deaf individuals. Their hands moved in rapid conversation, fluid and expressive, laughter filling the room in rhythms he felt more than heard. He stood at the edge, nervous, until an older man noticed him. With slow, deliberate movements, the man signed a single word. "Welcome." It was a revelation. For years, he had been a stranger in every room. Here, for the first time, he belonged. The meetings became his sanctuary. Surrounded by others fluent in silence, his signing improved quickly. He learned to joke, to argue, to express emotions too long bottled inside. His hands carried joy, anger, sarcasm, dreams. The community embraced him, not as an outsider, but as kin. At home, his mother watched in awe as he signed at the dinner table, teaching her simple gestures. She stumbled, but persisted. His father resisted at first, arms crossed, face stern. But one evening, after watching his son recount a story with blazing intensity, the father raised his own hands clumsily and shaped a single sign. Proud. The boy froze, then smiled. The gap between them, once wide as an ocean, had narrowed. He was no longer the silent child in the back of the classroom. He was becoming something else, a speaker without sound, a listener without ears, and slowly, a bridge between two worlds. Every community begins with a doorway. For him, it was a word traced in the air. Welcome. And through that doorway, his silence found its echo. Adulthood did not arrive with ease. It came with new barriers. University lectures that moved too quickly, professors who barely glanced in his direction, classmates who assumed he could not keep up. Yet he had already learned resilience in silence. Where others heard with ears, he listened with eyes, with memory. With discipline carved from years of exclusion, he prepared obsessively. Before each class, he studied the readings until he nearly memorized them. When the lecture came, he already knew the rhythm, the outline, the key words to watch for on the professor's lips. It was exhausting, but it worked. His notebooks filled with meticulous diagrams and annotations, his handwriting as precise as his focus. He was not merely learning, he was surviving an environment that had never been built for him. Still, the isolation deepened. Study groups passed him by. Social invitations never arrived. He ate alone, walked alone, and returned each night to a room where silence pressed in from every wall. Yet in that solitude, he practiced. He refined the language of his hands until it became second nature, his movements smooth, confident, alive. Then, one afternoon, something shifted. A visiting advocate gave a lecture on accessibility rights, accompanied by a professional sign language interpreter. For most in the audience, the novelty faded quickly, but for him, it was electric. He watched as the interpreter's hands mirrored every phrase with precision and grace, carrying meaning across the divide between sound and silence. The realization struck him like lightning. This was more than communication. This was power. He left the lecture hall with a decision already burning in his chest. He would become an interpreter, not simply for himself, but for those still trapped in silence without a bridge. Training was rigorous. Interpreting required more than fluency. It demanded stamina, empathy, and an almost surgical precision. Words were never enough. Tone, intent, and nuance had to be carried too. A raised eyebrow, a softened pause, a gesture held a second longer. All could alter meaning. He practiced relentlessly, recording himself, correcting each flaw. His hands ached, his arms cramped, but he pressed forward. There were skeptics. How can a deaf man interpret in courts, in hospitals, in critical settings? Some asked. They saw his silence as disqualification. But they misunderstood. His entire life had been interpretation, piecing fragments of sound into meaning, translating silence into survival. He was not unqualified. He was uniquely trained. He began with small events, community meetings, church gatherings, local clinics. Nervous at first, he soon found exhilaration in the work. Standing beside a speaker, his hands alive with translation, he felt a rush of clarity. He was not just relaying words, he was giving access, opening doors. Afterward, deaf attendees thanked him with tears in their eyes. For the first time, they said they had understood everything. The gratitude fueled him. Each assignment led to another. Schools, hospitals, town halls. He became known not only as a skilled interpreter, but as someone who carried dignity in his hands. He treated every word as sacred, every story as worthy of being heard. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. The world beyond small halls and local clinics was vast, indifferent, often hostile. In places of power, government offices, courtrooms, police stations, silence was still treated as guilt, as incompetence, as absence. He had seen it too many times. Deaf individuals dismissed, misrepresented, punished simply for not hearing. And so, as his skills sharpened, his vision expanded. Interpreting was not just a profession, it was a mission. His silence had taught him endurance. His hands had given him a voice. Now, he would use both to ensure others would never be erased. Every calling begins with a revelation. For him, it was not sound, but sight. The sight of hands bridging worlds. And in that moment, he knew his silence would no longer serve only himself. It would serve justice. The first time he walked into a courthouse as an interpreter, he felt the weight of centuries pressing down. Marble columns rose above him, the air thick with formality. This was not a community hall where laughter softened mistakes, nor a classroom where errors passed unnoticed. Here, words were weapons, precision was armor, and the slightest misunderstanding could tilt the scales of justice. He sat near the witness stand, plain-suited, quiet, hands resting lightly on his knees. Lawyers shuffled papers. The judge entered. The gavel struck. Sound flooded the room. Statements, objections, commands. All of it a torrent he could not hear. But he did not need to. He had trained his eyes to catch meaning in every flicker of movement. And when colleagues relayed phrases he could not lip-read, his hands translated without pause. At first, the attorneys barely noticed him. To them, he was a fixture, a service, a technicality. But when the witness, a deaf woman accused of petty theft, began to sign, the atmosphere shifted. Her hands trembled as she recounted her story, and he translated with clarity. Every gesture carried faithfully into words for the court. The details emerged. A misunderstanding at a store. An item mistaken. An arrest born of chaos. The judge leaned forward. The jury listened. For the first time, her voice existed in that room. The verdict was swift. Not guilty. Relief washed over her, and gratitude flickered in her eyes as she turned toward him. She signed softly. "Thank you." He nodded, signing back with equal gentleness. "Your truth spoke. I only carried it." That case was small, but it marked the beginning. Soon he was called again and again. Witnesses, defendants, even victims whose stories would otherwise vanish. Each time, he felt the same mixture of nerves and resolve. Courtrooms were fortresses of sound, and he was often treated as an outsider. Some lawyers doubted his ability, asking quietly, "Can he really manage this?" Some judges looked impatient, as though accessibility slowed the march of justice. But each time, he let his hands answer, steady and unyielding. The work took its toll. Trials stretched for hours, his arms aching from the relentless motion. Legal language was dense, riddled with jargon, layered with nuance. He poured himself into study, memorizing terminology, practicing how to render it into signs without losing meaning. It was exhausting, but he endured. He remembered the boy in the back of the classroom, clinging to scraps of lessons. If he had survived that, he could survive this. Gradually, his reputation spread. Among the deaf community, he became known as a lifeline. Families spoke of him with reverence. With him, we are heard. For many, it was the first time their words had entered official records without distortion. For him, it was validation, not of fame, but of purpose. Outside the community, however, skepticism lingered. Some still questioned the necessity of interpreters. Others saw them as mere accessories, not as essential bridges. He bore their ignorance with patience, but each trial strengthened his conviction. Silence was not absence. It was testimony waiting for translation. Then one day, a case arrived that would test him like no other. A man stood accused of a serious crime, the evidence stacked high, the narrative of guilt nearly unshakable. But whispers suggested a different story, that silence had once again been mistaken for defiance, that a man's life hung in the balance, not because of what he had done, but because of what he had not been allowed to say. He accepted the call without hesitation. As he prepared, he knew this trial would be more than a test of skill. It would be a battle between truth and the world's refusal to hear. And in that battle, his hands would decide whether silence would once again be buried or whether it would finally speak. Every profession has its crucible. For him, it was not a classroom or a hall, but the solemn weight of justice. And soon, his silence would face its greatest trial. The courthouse had become his second home, though never a comfortable one. Each case left its mark. Some ended quietly, others with tears, a few with victories that sent ripples through the deaf community. He carried them all: faces, stories, fragments of injustice scribbled afterward in his journal. The work was demanding, but it gave his silence a purpose. Word of his skill spread quickly. Families requested him by name. Lawyers who once doubted him now relied on his steady presence. In deaf households, his reputation was spoken with reverence. With him, we are not invisible. He did not bask in this recognition. Instead, it weighed on him, a responsibility heavier than applause. But outside that circle, ignorance remained thick. Some judges saw interpreters as obstacles, slowing the machinery of law. Policemen dismissed the need for them altogether. Employers still turned away. Resumes with gaps labeled communication barriers. Even colleagues in law whispered doubts. Can a deaf man really handle the speed of the courtroom? He never argued back. He simply let his hands answer. Trial after trial, until doubt gave way to grudging respect. He began attending advocacy meetings, often small, sometimes overlooked. In cramped community centers, he joined others in pushing for legal recognition of sign language, for mandatory interpreters in public institutions. At rallies, he stood among banners, his hands moving in rhythm with chants translated into motion. It was strange, watching his silence ripple outward, transformed into sound by others. For once, the exchange was reversed. His language at the center, theirs following after. Yet activism carried its own toll. Change came slowly, always slower than hope. Laws shifted in fragments. Budgets cut programs before they could flourish. And still, deaf defendants filled his docket, bewildered, misunderstood. Their silence mistaken for guilt. Each trial left him angrier, but also more determined. One case stayed with him like a shadow. A young woman accused of theft stood trembling in court, unable to explain herself. Without him, her gestures would have been written off as hysteria. Through his hands, the truth emerged. A bag mistakenly taken, a guard who never tried to understand. She was acquitted, but the shame lingered. He wrote that night in his journal, "Justice delayed by silence is justice denied." These moments hardened his resolve. He realized his role was more than interpretation. It was resistance, against a system that equated silence with ignorance, against a society that mistook difference for defiance. Each trial was a battlefield, each word a weapon carefully carried across the gulf. Then came the summons that would change everything. A man, deaf from birth, accused of a grave crime. The case was high profile. The evidence stacked, the newspapers already leaning toward guilt. Other interpreters hesitated. Too risky, too visible, too exposed. He accepted without pause. As the trial date drew near, he prepared with obsessive care. He studied the transcripts, memorized terminology, rehearsed late into the night. His hands grew sore, but he pushed through. This was not just another case. It was the culmination of every vow scribbled in notebooks, every humiliation endured in classrooms, every moment of silence mistaken for nothingness. Standing outside the courthouse on the morning of the trial, he gazed up at the stone columns, tall and unyielding. Crowds buzzed at the entrance, reporters scribbling headlines before proceedings even began. He adjusted his plain suit, steadied his breath, and placed a hand against his chest. Inside, history waited. The boy who once practiced signs in secret was about to stand in the center of a courtroom, carrying not only one man's defense, but the weight of an entire community's right to be heard. Every life has a turning point. For him, it was not a sudden miracle, but a summons to the place where silence and justice would finally collide. The courthouse that morning was a fortress of tension. Outside, reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing at every official who passed through the heavy doors. The case had gripped the public imagination. A deaf man accused of a serious crime. His silence portrayed as suspicion. His gestures twisted into menace. Few believed he would walk free. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The gallery overflowed. Law students eager to witness history, advocates from the deaf community, curious citizens drawn by the spectacle. Every seat was filled. Every eye turned toward the front where the accused sat, shackled not only by charges, but by the world's refusal to hear him. Beside him, the interpreter took his place. His suit was modest, his expression steady, though inside he felt the familiar storm of nerves. This was no ordinary trial. Every movement of his hands would be scrutinized, recorded, perhaps challenged. A single mistake could tilt the scales of justice. He pressed his palms together briefly, grounding himself in silence, before lifting them to begin. The prosecution opened with force. Their voice rang through the chamber, weaving a narrative of guilt. They described the accused as uncooperative, his silence as defiance, his frantic gestures as resistance. Witnesses nodded along, recounting the night of the arrest with polished certainty. To the jury, the picture was clear. A man who chose not to obey, who hid behind his silence. The interpreter translated every word, his hands moving with precision even as his chest tightened. He glanced at the accused, who shook his head in despair, signing rapidly in protest. The interpreter carried those signs too, shaping them into sound for the court. I did not understand. I was afraid. I tried to explain. The clash was stark. Authority on one side, vulnerability on the other. The jury leaned instinctively toward the uniformed officers, their voices smooth and confident. The accused's truth was raw, trembling, too easily dismissed. Day after day, the trial dragged on. The interpreter worked tirelessly, his arms aching, his eyes burning from relentless focus. Legal jargon poured across the room, motions, objections, testimony, and he translated it all, never faltering. He knew the stakes were larger than one man's freedom. If silence could be equated with guilt here, in this room, what chance did any deaf person have? Then came the moment that shifted everything. On the third day, the accused himself took the stand. The room fell silent. For weeks, his story had been told only by others. Police, neighbors, lawyers. Now finally he would speak. His hands shook at first, his movements hesitant, but the interpreter steadied him, mirroring each gesture into words. Slowly, the man's story unfolded. The flashing lights, the shouted commands he could not hear, the terror as officers closed in. He signed of raising his hands, not in aggression, but in pleading. He signed of being thrown to the ground before he could explain. His truth poured out in silence, carried faithfully into sound. The gallery leaned forward, transfixed. Jurors shifted uneasily, doubt flickering across their faces. The prosecution objected, tried to cut him short, but the judge allowed him to continue. For the first time, the accused was not a shadow on trial. He was a man with a story, and the courtroom was forced to listen. That night, the interpreter wrote in his journal, "Today, silence broke through. For the first time, they heard him, and they will not be able to forget." The trial was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. History does not always hinge on grand speeches. Sometimes it shifts when silence, long ignored, is finally given the chance to speak. By the trial's second week, the prosecution tightened its grip. They brought witness after witness, each reinforcing the same image. A man who refused to comply, who waved his arms wildly, who ignored the law. The jury listened intently, their pens scratching across paper. The defense fought back, but the momentum seemed to favor the state. Then came the arresting officer. Tall, confident, his uniform pressed to perfection, he carried the authority of the institution itself. He spoke clearly, deliberately, describing that night with unwavering conviction. According to him, the accused had resisted from the beginning. "He understood what we asked," the officer declared, but chose to ignore it. His silence was defiance. The interpreter's hands moved with discipline, shaping each word into signs. But his chest tightened as he glanced at the accused, who shook his head fiercely, signing rapid denials. The interpreter carried those too, his movements quick and urgent. "No, I did not understand. I was afraid." The clash was stark. On one side, the smooth authority of the officer. On the other, the trembling desperation of a man long unheard. The jury, conditioned to trust uniforms, leaned toward the voice backed by power. For a moment, it felt as though the case would collapse entirely. And then, during cross-examination, the defense attorney asked the question that split the silence open. "Officer, when my client was signing to you that night, did you understand what he was trying to say?" The officer hesitated. For the first time, his confidence cracked. "No," he admitted. "But that doesn't matter. He should have followed orders." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples through every face. The interpreter signed them slowly, deliberately, each gesture striking the air with weight. For the first time, the jury saw the truth. The accused had been punished not for resistance, but for being unheard. His silence had been criminalized. A murmur ran through the gallery. Advocates leaned forward. Even the judge shifted uneasily. The officer's testimony, meant to cement guilt, had instead revealed the cracks in the system itself. The accused raised his hands, signing with renewed urgency. He described the flashing lights, the shouted words he could not hear, the panic as he tried to explain. His gestures were frantic, trembling, but the interpreter steadied them into words, clear and precise. The courtroom leaned in, listening not to the sound of his voice, but to the rhythm of his silence made audible. The prosecution objected, tried to dismiss it as irrelevant, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the gap, the chasm between authority and understanding. That night, the interpreter returned home exhausted. His arms ached, his mind replaying every moment. He opened his journal and wrote, "Today, silence spoke louder than uniforms. Today, they began to see us not as problems, but as people." The trial was not yet decided, but something had shifted. The foundation of guilt, once so firm, had begun to crack. The jury had glimpsed the truth hidden beneath silence, and once glimpsed, it could not be unseen. Every system of power relies on unquestioned voices, but sometimes all it takes is one admission, one fracture in the story, to reveal that silence was never defiance, but desperation. And in that revelation, history begins to turn. The courtroom felt different the next morning. The officer's admission had cracked something open, and though the prosecution pressed forward, the atmosphere was no longer unshakable. Doubt lingered in the air, subtle but persistent, like a draft that would not be shut out. The defense sensed the shift and pressed harder. They argued that the accused had been silenced from the moment of arrest, that his gestures were not defiance, but desperate attempts at communication. They reminded the jury that justice was not obedience to sound, but fairness to all. Still, the prosecution struck back. They described the accused as reckless, unreliable. They suggested that his silence was convenient, that his gestures could mean anything. Their words cut not just at one man, but at an entire language, an entire community. Each sentence carried the old prejudice, that silence was emptiness, that sign was chaos. The interpreter felt the sting of those words, but he translated them faithfully, his hands steady. He knew his task was not to argue, but to ensure accuracy. And in that accuracy lay resistance. Truth, faithfully carried, would defend itself. Then came a moment no one expected. The defense called the accused's daughter to the stand. She was young, barely in her 20s, with eyes that mirrored her father's determination. She had grown up bilingual, straddling two worlds, sound and silence, and now she stepped forward to bridge them. She began with words, her voice trembling but clear. She spoke of her father's kindness, his patience, the countless times he had been misunderstood. She described the night of his arrest, how she had screamed that the officers weren't listening, how her father had signed desperately to explain. As she spoke, her hands moved too, signing along with her words, a duet of sound and silence. The interpreter mirrored her signs into English, but for many in the courtroom, the effect was overwhelming. It was not just translation, it was testimony in stereo. Her voice echoed in the room while her hands painted the same truth in the air. For the first time, the jury saw sign language not as chaos, but as clarity, alive, expressive, undeniable. The gallery stirred. Some jurors blinked back tears. Even the judge's gaze softened. The prosecution objected, arguing it was too emotional, too theatrical. But the moment had already landed. No objection could erase the image of a daughter defending her father in two languages at once. The accused watched, tears streaming down his face. His hands trembled as he signed. "She is my voice. She has always been my voice." The interpreter carried those words into sound, and the courtroom fell silent. When the daughter stepped down, the air felt transformed. The narrative of defiance had fractured completely. What remained was humanity. Raw, undeniable, visible in every raised hand, every trembling gesture. The interpreter, though exhausted, felt a quiet fire ignite in him. This was what he had vowed as a boy, that silence would one day matter, that the world would one day listen. And now, in this room, that vow was being kept, not by him alone, but by an entire family, an entire community, standing against erasure. That night, his journal bore new words. Today, they saw us. Not shadows, not problems. People. The trial was drawing toward its end, but its outcome was no longer certain. What had once seemed inevitable was now contested. Fragile, alive with possibility. Every story has a turning point. In this one, it was not a lawyer's argument or a judge's ruling. It was the raised hands of a daughter, weaving love and truth into silence, and forcing the world to hear. The final day arrived heavy with expectation. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, their cameras trained on every movement. Headlines had already been drafted, but none dared predict the outcome with certainty. Inside, the gallery overflowed with advocates, families, and members of the deaf community. For them, this trial was no longer just about one man. It was about whether silence could ever truly be heard. The accused sat at the defense table, shoulders tense but eyes steady. Weeks of testimony had worn him down, yet hope flickered in his gaze. Beside him, the interpreter folded his hands calmly, though his chest tightened with anticipation. He had translated every word of this trial, carried every tremor of truth. Now, he would carry the verdict. The prosecution gave their closing argument first. They returned to the familiar refrain. Authority must be obeyed. Silence cannot excuse disobedience. Chaos follows when orders are ignored. Their words were polished, their confidence unshaken. The interpreter signed them precisely, ensuring every barb, every accusation reached the accused. Accuracy was his discipline, even when the words cut deep. Then the defense rose. Their voice was not thunderous, but steady, deliberate. They reminded the jury of the officer's admission, that he had not understood. They reminded them of the daughter's testimony, the humanity revealed in her bilingual truth. This case, the attorney said, is not about defiance. It is about misunderstanding. It is about whether our courts will punish silence or learn to listen. The interpreter's hands moved with equal conviction, shaping the argument into signs. He felt the weight of the words settle in the room, not as performance, but as plea. The jury withdrew. Minutes passed, then hours. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the air taut as a wire. The accused sat rigid, his fingers twitching nervously. The interpreter waited beside him, steady, a quiet anchor. At last, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, paper trembling slightly. The judge asked for the verdict. Not guilty. The words struck the room like a bell. Gasps filled the gallery, followed by cheers. The accused collapsed into his hands, tears spilling freely. He looked to the interpreter, signing frantically. Free? Free? The interpreter nodded, his own hand steady. Free. And then, something extraordinary happened. In the gallery, dozens of hands rose into the air, palms open, fingers shimmering. Silent applause swept across the room, a wave of movement that needed no sound. The deaf community celebrated in the only way that was truly theirs. Silence transformed into thunder. The interpreter froze, his chest tight. He had seen this before at community gatherings, but here, in the solemn chamber of justice, it was different. It was defiance and triumph all at once. For once, silence was not absence. It was victory. Even the judge paused, gavel poised but unmoving, as if recognizing the moment's weight. The applause continued, shimmering like light across the courtroom. The accused turned to his daughter, embracing her fiercely. His hand shook as he signed. You gave me my voice. She shook her head, tears streaking her face, and signed back. It was always yours. The interpreter translated none of it. He knew the courtroom did not need those words. They belonged to father and daughter alone. That night at his desk, he opened his journal one last time. He wrote slowly. Today, silence won. And in winning, it spoke for us all. Verdicts are often spoken in words, but sometimes justice is rendered in raised hands, in a silence so loud it cannot be ignored. On that day, silence carried the weight of freedom. The courthouse steps were crowded that evening, reporters clamoring, microphones raised, headlines already forming. But beyond the noise of cameras and questions, something deeper had shifted. The trial was over, but its echo would endure. For once, silence had not been a mark of guilt. It had been the force that freed a man. In the days that followed, his name appeared in newspapers, though never as the center. The headline spoke of the acquittal, the controversy, the officer's admission. But in the deaf community, the story was told differently. They spoke of the interpreter, of the man who had carried another's truth with such precision that it could not be denied. He had not argued, had not protested, had not raised his voice. He had simply let silence speak faithfully, and in doing so, changed everything. Invitations soon arrived. Advocacy groups wanted him to share his experience. Universities asked him to lecture. Lawmakers invited him to testify on accessibility reforms. He accepted some, declined others. He was not a man drawn to stages or speeches. His calling remained in the quiet corners, in the courtrooms, where silence still risked being erased. Still, he recognized the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. His journal entries, once private vows and observations, became testimonies he shared. He spoke of the boy in the back of the classroom, struggling to read lips, of the first book of signs found in a dusty library, of the day when silence was mistaken for defiance, and the trial where it was finally heard as truth. Change came slowly, as it always does. But it came. Courts began mandating interpreters as a right, not a courtesy. Schools introduced sign language courses. Awareness grew inch by inch, and in each new reform, he saw a reflection of the vow he had written as a child. One day, they will listen. He never stopped working. Trial after trial, he carried stories across the gulf. Each case was different, but the mission was the same: to ensure that silence could no longer be ignored. He knew he could not dismantle centuries of prejudice alone, but he also knew that each gesture, each translation, chipped away at the wall. Years later, at a community gathering, he stood quietly at the back as children signed to one another with ease. Their hands moved quickly, playfully, confidently, without fear of mockery, without hesitation. Elders told stories freely, their signs fluent, their laughter ringing in silence. He watched, humbled. This was the world he had longed for as a boy. A place where silence was not weakness, but language. When people recognized him and lifted their hands in applause, he signed back, modest, grateful. For him, it was not about recognition. It was about continuity. The struggle was not over, but the path was clearer than ever. Later that evening, he stepped outside. The sky was fading into twilight, the air cool against his face. He thought of the boy he had once been. Lonely, mocked, invisible. He thought of the man he had become. Steady, relentless, carrying voices that were never his own, but always sacred. They were not separate. They were one story, written in silence. He raised his hands, not to interpret for others, but to honor his own vow. His fingers shaped a single word: justice. The camera lingers on him in silhouette against the dimming sky, hands frozen in mid-motion. A quiet monument to a life lived in service of truth. Narrator's closing words. History often remembers the voices that shout the loudest. But sometimes, its most enduring chapters are written by those who never spoke at all. He was one of them. A boy who found a language in silence, a man who carried others into the light, an interpreter in the shadows. And though his name may fade, the echo of every silence carries a story. All we must do is listen.